Good morning, everyone. My name is Linda Lall, and I'm with Adapt Community Network. And we're very proud to present the Family Connect Family Summit this morning. It is a full day of information for families and professionals in the field of developmental disabilities. It is an opportunity for family members of all ages to take away some information that you can use in working with your family member. We're going to begin with a plenary session to talk about the future of housing options. And included in this panel is Edward Matthews, CEO of Adapt Community Network, as well as Roger Bearden, who is the Executive Deputy Commissioner for the Office of People with Developmental Disabilities, and Patricia Hernandez, who is a licensed social worker and the director of the Metro team for the Corporation for Supported Housing. And it is an opportunity for you to hear about options for housing beyond traditional group homes. Followed by this, there will be 1-hour sessions, and it will cover a variety of topics, including how to advocate your child and participate in an IEP session, going all the way through to managing the positive approaches to handling your loved one, whether they be a child, an adolescent, or an adult. How to be an advocate. There's a session where you will hear other family members managing this system for their child. And you will have an opportunity to ask questions. You just enter your question into the Q&A section on your computer, and it will be answered in the manner in which you asked it. I wish that you have a productive day. These sessions will run all day, ending at approximately 4 o'clock this afternoon. We hope you find it helpful and informative. Enjoy the day. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Linda. I just wanted to, again, welcome everyone to our plenary session, which is sponsored by Pilot RB. My name is Tracy Picard. I'm going to be moderating the session. I'm the Vice President of Family Support Services here at Adapt Community Network. At Adapt, I oversee our Family Services program, which includes family reimbursement, community habilitation, several housing programs, and our information referral line, Project Connect. A couple of housekeeping rules. As Linda mentioned, we will have time for questions for the presenters. Please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. If you are having any technical difficulties, there will be answers to commonly asked questions in the chat section. This session is being recorded. You can watch it online later at www.adaptcommunitynetwork.org, and be sure to follow us on social media at Adapt We Change. It is my pleasure to welcome you to today's session featuring Edward Matthews, Roger Bearden, and Patricia Hernandez. Let's get started. Please welcome our panel. So the first question that I have, and Ed, this is gonna go to you. How do you see the landscape of developmental disability community change in the next 5 years?
Probably faster than it did in the last 5 years, to be honest. I've been around a long time. I've worked for government and voluntary sector, and starting even before we had the Willowbrook consent decree, in which about 5,000 people were moved out of institutions into the community-based settings. The main way we could do that, and frankly, the main housing option that's been available since almost for the last 45 years has been a group home. Now, we've called them different things. They were community residents, they were intermediate care facilities, they were independent residential alternatives, depending on the funding source that we were using. But primarily it's been a group home for anywhere from 6 to 20 people, depending on region and size and everything else. I think, both from a family standpoint and from, a regulatory standpoint, and frankly, from a money standpoint and from people wanting more independent standpoint, I think the number of residential sites that we have is going to not grow the way it has, obviously, in the last 45 years for all kinds of reasons. But I think, families now want more independence. People want more independence. And so the idea of living in supported housing and, affordable supported housing with some interim supports and other kinds of monitoring, I think is going to be the way of the future. And I think the younger parent with their child is really seeking a lifestyle where they're more integrated into the community, that they're living, working, and playing with their next door neighbors and not necessarily isolated. So I think we're going to see a lot more of that. I think we're going to see a lot more work options for people. We've talked about work and employment for as long as I can remember, but I think Governor Hochul just today, frankly, announced a new initiative, the rights of people with developmental disabilities to employment, and has announced a brand new initiative for the State Office of People with Developmental Disabilities, for employers, for voluntary agencies to really band together and make a real effort now that the pandemic is a bit easing on how we're going to really push to get more and more people into the workforce. And so between housing, workforce, and those kinds of options, I think, over the next 5 years. And of course, there's the specter of how all of this will be paid for, what kind of financial platform we're going to have, whether we move to managed care or we don't, or, depending on, how people view that and how that's going to get paid for, and the availability of those dollars, I think, is going to change how we operate as programs, how parents view the world, and how individuals relate to their non-disabled peers and neighbors. I think it's going to be a huge change, and one for the better.
Great, thanks, Ed. Roger, can I pose the same question to you, and then, add on sort of how you see your role changing, as you discuss some of the changes that you anticipate, over the next 5 years.
And the you here is sort of government / OPWD, not Roger Bearden, right? Because that's of my interest.
Yes.
So
yes.
I'm actually fully, I fully agree with what Ed's saying, and would maybe amplify it in a couple of directions. First of all, in terms of the employment, I think it's really important. The governor did sign a bill, I think on Tuesday, to actually reduce from 75% to 50% the number of people with disabilities who would be in a particular work setting in order to qualify for preferred source. So that's moving away from a disability specific environment to a more integrated environment. So it's supportive of the idea, Ed, that you're talking about, the people looking for a kind of a more normalized experience in their employment, in their housing. I think any discussion about the future of supports and services has to start with the workforce issues. When we're talking about a staffed model of a group home, and I agree, Ed, it's gone by different names over different times, but it's pretty similar one to the next. But you're talking about a staffed model, 24/7 typically in that environment. And the fact is right now that with pandemic, with everything else going on in the economy, it's incredibly difficult for the provider agencies. It's incredibly difficult for OPWDD as a provider of services to find qualified people who can do the job. So if you're reliant on a model that is primarily dependent on staffing 24/7 for most of your care, it's going to be very, very hard to meet the needs of families in this new reality. I think that drives also to the importance of technology. There are remote monitoring, really very successful practices. I think ADAPT has been very much at the forefront of this, also with some of the remote ability to access, telemedicine, to do triages, to do even some simple, guided treatment, so that people don't have to go to the hospital, don't have to go, to an outpatient clinic to get a necessary service. So I think you're going to see a lot more use of that kind of technology in support of staff and in support of families. And then the other thing that I think that is really impactful as we think about all of this is the changing demographics. We are very much seeing, at least within the service population of OPWDD, massive, increases in people with autism and people with dual diagnoses, people who have, both mental illness and a developmental disability. So figuring out how to better, partner with, with other state agencies, with our provider communities. So it might be housing that is supporting people who have a dual diagnosis, I think is going to become really important. And that just links to the last piece, which is the role of government in OPWDD. I think we're going to need to be a lot more reliant on our partnerships across various state agencies across different provider types. So providers that maybe haven't previously had services and supports for people with mental illness. Maybe they've been focused on intellectual or developmental disability, or maybe they've been a mental health service provider. We're going to need to be able to find ways to create more blended services to meet those changing demographics. And that's going to change who we are, because I think OPWDD has tended to operate, in its own kind of lane. And that's just going to not really meet the needs of people moving forward.
Great, thanks, Roger. And so Patricia, I guess my question to you then is a follow-up to a few things that Roger talked about. There's a lot of upcoming changes that families can anticipate. How do you think families can start to prepare now for some of these upcoming changes?
Yeah, and thank you for having me here. And I just want to say, I feel like I'm in the perfect position because my role is to talk to the providers and talk to the city agencies about how to create supportive housing for people who need it. So I do want to talk a little bit about supportive housing, and supportive housing is traditionally was one way, and I think we're starting to expand the populations of who would benefit from supportive housing. And just to level set, what is supportive housing? Supportive housing is affordable housing, right? It's deeply affordable permanent housing with wraparound services. So what that means is folks in supportive housing have their own apartment, have their own lease, pay 30% of their income towards rent, but also have the benefit of having some sort of social services or case management wraparound services to make sure those folks are connected to care, whether that's healthcare, behavioral health care, and other things. And really, supportive housing is designed to help people with the most complex challenges live with stability, dignity, and autonomy in the community. So what we're seeing is this shift for different populations to start living in supportive housing. Traditionally, supportive housing was really focused on folks who are chronically homeless, so those people who are in the shelter or on the street, and then folks with severe mental illness and substance use disorders. I think we're seeing a shift for other populations. So for instance, here in New York, so ESHI, which is the Empire State Supportive Housing Initiative, it provides funding for organizations to develop supportive housing and to have supportive housing services. And they've expanded their definition of who qualifies. So we have now supportive housing for people impacted by the carceral system, people who are aging and have medically complex needs, people in domestic violence situations. So there's no reason why we can also include people with developmental disabilities. And actually across the country, we're starting to see more of this. So one way that states get money for housing is through the qualified allocation plans. And for example, I think we've seen in Indiana where they have a specific set aside to receive housing development funds for people with disabilities. And we see things in Illinois where they're taking public housing authorities and rehabbing them and then creating supportive housing with people with developmental disabilities. So I think kind of excited to talk to Roger about some of those possible opportunities and how we can really help folks, because as Ed said, people do want to live with autonomy. People don't want to be in an institutionalized setting, and supportive housing really does provide that model.
Great, thanks, Patricia. Ed, I guess to follow up with you, how can families, what can they do today to start to think about preparing for these upcoming changes that are happening? Patricia touched on some related to supported housing, but if you want to speak a little more broadly.
Well, I think, I think obviously for parents of very young children, this is something that they view like any parent, this is something that you view in the future about what is my child going to become, what are they going to do, and where are they going to live. But I think for folks who are really worried about, for instance, the parents of teenagers who want to think, what's the next step? What's the transition into adulthood? And how can they leave the house and become independent? I think the first thing you want to be sure about is that you are connected to an organization who can help guide you through the process, whether it's here, whether it's one of the RSCs or one of the housing agencies. I think you should get as much information as possible. And the other thing is, one of the things that Roger touched on, I think, is for those folks who I think have kids or loved ones who are somewhat technology dependent, I think one of the things is the mastering of technology will lead a lot of folks who were before thought not to be able to manage things on their own, whether it's because of a mobility impairment or other kinds of things, that to be able to master those things and become familiar with those things, and not only the devices, but the whole world of technology, smart technology, is something I think parents and families, both through the internet and through organizations that supply demonstration projects or other ways of getting us, other ways of getting people familiar with this and getting their loved ones familiar with this. The more people know, the more you can master technology and know what's out there, is the more prepared you're going to be for that life transition into adulthood.
Great, thank you. Roger, as I'm sure you know, on the OPWDD website, it says that OPWDD is supporting people to live, work, and take part in their community. So if you could give some examples about what OPWDD is doing now to help support housing needs.
Sure. And if I could just pivot back for a second
absolutely.
on the prior question, I think I fully support, Ed, what you're saying in terms of like coming up with a concept of, what do you think that life for your loved one might look like, and to be thinking about that. I think the other piece of it, and I know there's a panel later today about advocating within the school system. I think one of the real challenges, OPWD's more robust supports kind of come into play when people are entering adulthood. We do provide supports to children as well, but it's kind of the broader. I think one of the biggest challenges for a lot of families is that transition. So having the right skills. You spoke about technology skills, Ed. I could say socialization skills, pre-vocational skills, those kinds of skills, which need to be learned in school. I think part of the challenge is that transition, and we're looking very closely at whether we actually have the right types of services to support teenagers in particular in transition, to support that, with obviously the school playing the lead role in that training. In terms of housing, we do have more than just group homes. We actually have a supportive housing program, relatively, I think, undersubscribed in the 5 boroughs of New York City. What we have, so a couple of things in terms of housing. I think at the most integrated level, we do offer a housing voucher. For reasons historic, we call it ISS. I like to call it housing voucher because I think it's clear what that is. Over 6,000 people receive it. The challenge had been that the amounts had not been updated since 2012. Fortunate to get the support in last year's budget to be able to bring those numbers up using HUD fair market rent values to 2021, and importantly to index it. So we've really removed that from the year-to-year budget conversation. So whatever the HUD level is going to be that year, which is something that is calculated on a federal level, will be the level of our housing voucher. There's a fair amount of administrative work right now to update over 6,000 housing vouchers to accommodate that. And that should be available, I think, in the next number of weeks for families and on a going forward basis. In terms of supportive housing, we have, I think, over about 300 people right now in supportive housing. We've been relatively, I would say, late to the game compared to, you know, other service sectors. Year to year, we have a $15 million capital allocation that's been happening for the last 4 or 5 years towards supportive housing. There's a competitive process where, you know, a provider would come with an application to us as OPWDD first to get our support, because what we're lending there is not only the capital money, but also we would be associating housing vouchers to the project to provide the operating support. You know, different, and we've had a lot of success actually in Western New York, where I think there's been a lot of uptake. I'm not sure exactly why there's been a little less uptake in the downstate region. So we have that. I think what we're looking at is a expansion of a model which has been relatively underused called supportive IRA. So that is something with a less than 24/7 supports. You know, typically an apartment living, but still a certified model. So there's that level of oversight. We only have a couple thousand people in that statewide. Seems like that, you know, when we look at kind of the levels of people's acuity and the kind of needs and supports they might get, we could expand that. And then in terms of, you know, in terms of the supervised IRA and the ICF and, you know, the more intensive services that were spoken about earlier, you know, those continue to be a very important model. I think the big challenge for us is trying to get the payment structure aligned with the level of need of people being served there. Right now, we have a really, really big challenge with some of the folks who have the most complex needs in our system, who too often end up in hospitals for long periods of times or other inappropriate environments. So we're looking at ways of enhancing on a rate model to be able to pay more money essentially for those highest needs people. That's something that we've been working on for probably about 9 months and will likely be able to kind of announce more publicly within the next month or two is the hope.
That's great. Thanks, Roger. And I will say, if anyone wants to hear more about ISS, it's a program that I help oversee here at Adopt. So feel free to reach out. It's a wonderful program. Patricia, you know, I think if we have a lot of families listening in on today's call, and they're families of younger children, of adolescents, and adults. So, you know, as it relates to kind of supportive housing, you know, what can families start to think to do today to prepare their loved one for supportive housing in the future?
Yeah, so I think really that service connection is key. So making sure people are connected to the right services and case management supports that know how to access supportive housing. So supportive housing is not, it's complicated in New York on how to access it depending on who's funding the supportive housing. So really having that expertise to understand how to put a supportive housing packet together and how to set people up for interviews. I think also just educating on what supportive housing is, right? There's different types of supportive housing. So somebody can be in an apartment and just a regular apartment with a voucher and then have services come in a couple of times a month to make sure the person's okay, right? For somebody who needs that level. Whereas some folks might be in a different type of setting where a provider actually has an office downstairs, but it's a building with, you know, affordable housing tenants and supportive housing tenants. So I think it's just kind of understanding what it is and what makes sense for the folks, because it is independent, right? So I think it's preparing folks to really live independently, but making sure that there's wraparound support services. So the earlier somebody can get to some sort of case management support that's able to guide through the process, because it does take a bit of time, would be my recommendation.
And if somebody wanted to get, you know, more information about what your organization provides, what's the best way for them to get that information?
Yeah, so just a couple of things. So we don't provide supportive housing ourselves, but we work with organizations to develop the supportive housing, and we're kind of a systems connector. But after this, I'm happy to share out some information on how to connect to us and how to connect to entities that work to get people into supportive housing. So I'm happy to share that afterwards, if that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
Tracy, if I could just,
Go ahead,
I
Ron.
think that most folks, once they're determined eligible for OPWD services, would be would be hooked into a care coordination organization, which is our care management system. So I don't know that, assuming that a lot of the parents who are on this call are ones who maybe already have had their loved ones determined eligible for OPWD services. So we certainly see them within our system as a vital entry point, and we're looking at ways of making sure that those care managers always do understand the full range of housing options, because that's really who, from our perspective, would be navigating. And then Tracy, I know you said you've got the ISS program. We do have a little bit of a, I know that provider agencies like yourself also for beneficiaries of that are, help them kind of manage the day-to-days of the challenges with respect to living in housing.
Yeah, and that's where we can support on the provider side, right? Really doing that training and capacity building so folks understand the range of housing and how to really connect into it. So, working with organizations like yourself, so your case managers are understanding what the eligibility is for supportive housing, how to access it, et cetera. So we can support in that way for sure.
And then Roger, if anybody is listening and they're saying, my child is not OPWDD eligible, what is sort of the best next step for them to take?
Yeah, well, so there's two pathways, because one, obviously, if somebody is needing supports and services, then they should be contacting the front door at OPWDD. I will also say that we have the family support services contracts with a number of our provider agencies, including ADAPT, that are intended to help families, whether or not they've been deemed eligible for OPWD services. Right. So sometimes that can be a good kind of entry point, to be able to figure out, what's going on in my life, and how might, where are the supports and services that might be most relevant to me. Ed, I had cut you off earlier. I apologize.
No, it's quite all right. I was just, supported housing is sort of a catch-all category that we use, and different people understand it different ways. There are, of course, some set-asides for this. I mean, a lot of organizations who previously just ran, certified settings are starting to do. There are a number of real estate companies and developers who work to develop supported housing. Pick up a newspaper in the city of New York, and you'll find Mayor Adams any day of the week saying we don't have enough supported housing for everybody. I mean, we have, all of the asylum seekers, immigrants, and so forth and so on. Ultimately, housing becomes the key towards permanency. So that's no less true for people with developmental disabilities who, as I said, the number of group homes are going to be limited in terms of how many we build again. But, this is the alternative here. So agencies like ours start to work with developers. Now we're sort of, some people have been doing this, some agencies have been doing this with, as Roger pointed out, for varying groups now for a period of time. I mean, people with behavioral health problems, mental health issues, the homeless. So there are set-asides, and then developers get these sort of tax credits that they can use for competitive housing projects. And so there are a number of people that we're starting to work with, and land is available. And, there are grants, as Patricia pointed out, from the Empire State Group, and there are other things that help agencies get started. And as Roger pointed out, there is a pot of $15 million, which we can decide later on whether it's enough or too little, and for New York City. But so there's different ways to access this. But I think for families, I think, to me, as we start to look from transition from school to work to housing, I think for me, the idea is these are the kinds of things that you're now going to have to think about. The idea that My child is going to go from school to a certified service for a day service, and then into a group home. That'll be still true for some people with the highest needs and 24-hour needs. For some, that's still going to be true. But for folks who, have as supported needs, I think this is going to be the wave of the future. And I think people just kind of have to start thinking in that vein, and it's good vein, that, there'll be more independence to this, and start thinking about that and start preparing sort of mentally for the idea that, this isn't going to be a 24-hour service in certified settings, that, the agencies will be there and the supports that people need when they need them will be there. For instance, and there are different things here. Then they'll require some regulatory change. For instance, the state of Kansas has sort of allowed for cameras in these supported settings. Now, we can talk about the invasion of privacy, but it all has to do, people have to consent and all of this stuff. But they're in their supported housing program, they allow for cameras and interaction so that, one staff person, can help monitor and help work with people in 6 or 7 or 8 different settings through this use of assistive, the cameras and technology, and prompt people to remind them to take their meds and all the rest of this stuff. And in an emergency, there are staff available to be there in a couple of minutes, but because they'll be readily available. These are the kinds of ways in which I think a lot of folks who can be independent are going to be supported, and it's ways that I think families start to think about those things as we broaden the spectrum of how we support people in New York State.
If I could, and just, one other area, and I think it relates to housing, but it's more foundational. One of the things that I think is also going to be different is in thinking about younger people and their decision-making capacity. So I think whereas the system of the past would default to group home as a choice, and would default to guardianship as a default choice. And one of the things that we've been working very hard on as OPWD is with our partners in the community is to enable supported decision making in New York State, and to have people be able to make decisions for themselves with the support of their circle of support to the largest degree possible. And I think that connects to living and working independently, being able to make decisions for oneself as much as possible. So it's something where, when we're thinking about the system of the future, I think that, a greater degree of empowerment for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, I think is another feature. Ed, I would love it if you could send me some information about what you're talking about in Kansas. I know that our policy director actually got on the train and went to Kansas last summer to go check out a few things. So I know we're at all roads lead to Kansas or something like that. There's a book. What's the matter with Kansas? That's the book. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I'd be glad to.
Thank you.
And Patricia, in terms of sort of the educational pieces, Roger and Ed both touched on them, like how important that is for families. If you could talk a little bit about kind of what your organization does to help support families in terms of gaining access to resources, whether it's through any kind of educational initiatives, or where you would advise families who are looking to gain more information about supportive housing, independent living, to start to look.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we have increased, most of our training and education are for the direct people who are helping families, right? So we support the providers, case managers who are doing the help of the family. But we do have, and this is something that we're starting to expand, we do have a lot of education and training and work with what we call people with lived experience, just people who are in the system experiencing homelessness, navigating OPWD, navigating the behavioral health system. So that's something that we are definitely interested in expanding. You can always reach out. We have a great website with lots of information, and we are the connector. Again, so reaching out to us will allow us to then find the best resource for that family in the community that can help, find housing or can help provide case management or whatever it is.
Great, thank you. We've had quite a lot of questions come in through Q&A. So I think, and some of them are related directly to some of the topics that we've already touched on. So I think we will go there next. The first question, and Roger, this will be for you. Are there currently any programs with transitional services to supportive or independent housing similar to ComHab that teach skills about maintaining a home, such as paying bills, et cetera, for adults? You're muted, Roger.
Thank you so much for that.
Yeah.
You think after 2.5 years of pandemic life, we learn to find the unmute button. So, I think that, certainly ComHab is actually a very broad service. So I think a lot of those activities could be encompassed in that. We are looking right now at potentially creating a kind of a housing navigation service, which is more about, dealing with the intricacies of going around and dealing with a complicated real estate market and finding housing. Which would be more of a time limited service. But I think that in answer to the question, a lot of what's being described there could be covered under ComHab. And I'm looking at Ed, who's nodding in agreement, which I'm glad for, because obviously that's it would be agencies like ADAPT that would be actually delivering the services.
That's right.
May I add as well? I know we talked before about folks with like dual diagnosis, so people who might have behavioral health issues. So there is this, there's OMH, so Office of Mental Health offers licensed housing in a transitional setting, particularly for people who they're not ready for independence yet, but they need a lot of that coaching and independent skill building before moving into the permanent supportive housing space. So if the person also seems to have, some sort of severe mental illness, they might qualify for that as well.
Okay, great.
One of the things I think that families most, in addition to, being worried about how independent their child can be, and want them to be, and, the ability to master some of the life skills that people in the question were talking about and Roger was talking about. And I agree that there, in addition to taking people on outings and doing things, I mean, one of the things we can really pay attention to is helping folks master those sort of independent life skills. But the other thing is about health. And I think that, one of the things I think we really have to pay a lot more attention to as people want to be independent and should be independent is how we make sure that they're connected to the proper healthcare providers. And, many of the supportive housing programs that we talk about are connected to community health centers, either close to or sometimes co-located with. And I think that's going to be a benefit as people move through the system, that that they have a permanency of healthcare and a co-location of healthcare, so that some of their needs and some of the as they get older, or even some of the folks already have some health needs, are able to be connected to the health centers. And right now families do that. I mean, you're connected to clinics throughout the city, and parents and families are very, very cognizant of that and spend a lot of time on that. But as people become independent, we want to make sure that we do the same job in lieu of the families, that we want to make sure people are connected to the proper health care. And so a lot of these supported housing programs also are connected to community health centers and other health centers that I think it's going to be a benefit as we move forward and more people with IDD are moved into this type of setting.
Great, thanks, Ed. So the most frequently asked question in the Q&A is, who can apply for a housing voucher and how does the process work to apply?
Sure. So if somebody for the OPWD housing voucher, because there's a lot of different housing vouchers out. Obviously, there's Section 8 and other types of housing vouchers. For OPWD, it would run through our regional offices. So if it's primarily, I think, a New York City audience to this meeting, it would be our New York City regional office. somebody has to be eligible for OPWDD services. I saw in the chat in the Q&A that somebody could have a mental illness, but it would that they'd have to have a developmental disability and significant enough limitations from that developmental disability to be able to qualify for OPWDD services. Once you're qualified for services, then there's a process by which what services might you want, and what services might you need, and the housing voucher, if interest in living independently is there for for a person, then the housing voucher would be something that would be available to that person. And obviously, if there's interest in not living independently, then something like a group home or other kind of a more more congregate setting would be the appropriate setting. So, but it all really just does start running through our regional offices, and we have what we call our front door. They offer information sessions for families that would be interested in understanding what are the criteria to be eligible. And there's also information on our website about the basics about being determined eligible for OPWD services.
Great, thanks, Roger.
Mhm.
I think everyone here has touched on the interconnectedness between housing and employment. And so one of the questions that did come up was, how can we receive help with job placement for individuals that are looking to enter the workforce? So Ed, do you want to take this one?
Well, most of the agencies that are in this field do have a supported employment program. Now, I think one of the problems we face is that we have a lot of people in supported employment and very few people with jobs. So there are, and especially now, during the last couple of years, it's unfortunately been one of the things that I think most of the agencies and people paid least amount of attention to. But I think with the governor's initiative, and probably Roger can talk a little bit more about the governor's disability employment rights initiative that was all over the newspapers this morning and announced this morning. I think there'll be a statewide initiative now for employers and agencies and state offices like OPWDD to really form a new initiative to get more and more people into the workforce. There's always been some tax credits for employers, but I think now in the state they're really going to start to give employers incentives to hire people with disabilities who have historically been, some of the most reliable people in the workforce. And I think one of the things that we're trying to focus on is, with technology now and with the ability of a lot of folks to master it, the types of jobs people can get and the types of jobs that are out there, higher paying jobs, are really going to be more, available for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. I mean, by and large, there's been a lot of supermarket clerks. So I think probably if we went nationwide and just talked about all the jobs that people with developmental disabilities have, I think beyond, triple the amount of anything else would be people working in retail, in supermarkets and so forth. And while those jobs are great and they will continue to be there, I think now people being able to who have mobility impairments and so forth, being able to master technology and get these types of jobs that, accounting jobs and other kinds of payroll jobs and other kinds of things like that are going to be much more available. And the initiative, I think, that the governor is pushing and state agencies are pushing and the agencies will push, is really getting people trained for much more competitive employment than maybe in the past. And so that's really the future. We have to gear ourselves up for it after a couple of years of really not paying a lot of attention to employment because people were sort of stuck and everybody was sort of at home. But I think now with this initiative, and we thank Governor Hochul for that initiative, that I think we're going to have a lot more attention paid to this, and I think you'll see a lot more opportunities for folks to get training and to get jobs.
Yeah, and just to build on what you said, Ed, yeah, so I was proud to actually represent our agency at the launch of the initiative. And the governor has been very, very clear. Governor Hochul has been clear in terms of this being at the very top of her agenda in terms of people with disabilities. I would say that in some ways we've been focused a lot on the supply side, meaning the support services that OPWDD through its provider agencies, the supported employment and the other support services to get people job ready, to get them the skills. I think the place where we've been comparatively weaker is the demand side. Having employers seeking out the employment of people with disabilities. And I think something that collectively we can be doing is actually putting some pressure, right, on employers, on companies to say, hey, where are you at, with engaging and including people with disabilities as part of your workforce, not because it's charity, not because it's some sort of social services, because it's part of inclusion. It's part of, developing a society that embraces all people, including people with disabilities. In the same way that if you looked at an employer that wasn't hiring people within a protected class, women or people who of a certain race or ethnicity, you might say, well, wait a minute, you're not, this isn't right. So I think we can be focusing a lot on both the value of people with disabilities and also kind of pressuring generally that, hey, everybody ought to be doing their part here. Because I think that there are a lot of folks who are ready, willing, and able to work, and they just haven't had the opportunities because of biases, prejudices, et cetera, against people's capacity.
Great, thanks, Roger. Patricia, anything you'd like to add on this topic? No, okay. Great. We're getting close to time. One question that has also come through, which I know it can be a little complicated, how people with intellectual and developmental disabilities that are working, but they're concerned about losing their benefits. If that's a concern, what would you recommend as sort of a next step? I guess, Roger.
Yeah, it's a big issue. It's a federal issue.
Yeah.
I wouldn't say that I fully understand the intricacies of the benefits, but the problem is that when people get to a certain level of substantial gainful activity or a certain amount of wage, then they're excluded from SSI. And then the SSI may be not that big of a deal because they're making a wage at that point, but then that can have the effect of kicking them out of the Medicaid program, which is often a very, very big deal in terms of getting access to, healthcare and other related services. I think there are some things on the state level with our use of the Medicaid buy-in program, which I think has continued to be undersubscribed. I know it's something that is not just an OPWDD issue, that, because it impacts people with mental illness, people with other disabilities who when they earn are sort of penalized for that achievement. It's something we're aware of. I wish I could tell you that I had a ready solution, but it's something that's sort of high on the list of we really need to figure this out because it's directly contrary to everything we're trying to accomplish.
And this is where, advocacy among parents also plays an important role.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. As we only have a couple minutes left, I just want to, I started to pose this question a little bit earlier, but, for those listening today that want to know, we always want to walk away, give people sort of practical next steps, what they can do. So if people are wanting to get some more information about housing, employment, any of the topics that we've covered today, what would you say, Ed, is a good next step?
Well, I can't tell everybody to come to Adapt Community Network. There's only so many people we can, but most folks have a relationship with one of the provider organizations, and it's our job to get people that information, to give them the information they need when they need it. So most of the organizations that people are aligned with, and certainly as Roger pointed out before, what we call the CCOs, the care coordination organizations, and your care manager, that's part of the life plan, right? For us to be able to get information to people so that and to provide those resources for people to be able to access not only the system or the health system, but to be able to access both the training and information for the life transitions. And so that's something that we need and do hopefully coordinate even more on now that we did before, because the world is opening up. I mean, the pandemic's not over, but the world is opening up, and the world of independence is opening up for a lot of reasons. So that's our collective job. The CCOs, the provider organizations, and OPW. That's our collective job, to get that information to people when they need it, and they should hold us accountable for that.
I would agree with Ed, and I would add that I think if you're conceptualizing of a life for yourself, your loved one, oftentimes the best source of information is other people who have already been down that path, right? So I know that from, other families, to, if there's somebody who's a little bit older, that maybe has gone down a particular pathway that looks appealing, how'd you get there, right? Because, there's a lot of things out there to help people, and there are systems in place, OPWD, the provider agencies, the care coordinations, organizations, all those things are there. But I do think that, sort of the informed consumer is the one that's going to be best able to navigate those systems. And so to be able to kind of work with, I know that, ADAPT and other organizations have parents, support groups. There's unaffiliated ones like a parent to parent. But I really think if we're talking about families supporting each other, and I think that becomes really, really vital, because that's how people can be, I think, most successful in navigating the systems, which are always too complicated for their own good. And so, to be able to kind of help others is often very, very helpful in this kind of situation.
Yep, I agree, Roger. And ADAPT offers Project Connect, which helps connect families to, both services within ADAPT, but also, to other agencies and organizations, depending on the services that they're requesting. And we'll put that information, how to connect with Project Connect in the chat.
Tracy, just from a systems level, I think we all need to do a better job of working across different systems and not be so siloed. I think to work on homeless issues, housing instability, the only way is to be collaborative and work together, and also really understanding one thing that we would love to see is folks who are probably already those who were running group homes, maybe they can get into the development of supportive housing, and how can we support those folks, right? So they can, again, it's moving to a more independent model. We'd love to support organizations. So if anybody is a provider here that's interested in that training, or, thinking about development, we'd be happy to offer our support.
Great. Thanks so much, Patricia. So we are, Roger, you look like, I was about to say we're at time, but I'm going to.
Can I just throw one thing out, which is,
yeah.
There's a number of questions that were not addressed that maybe are more specific. I just wanted to offer info, INFO at opwdd.ny.gov is our correspondence email address. So if you have a question that you felt wasn't addressed, or a specific situation that you need, we have a whole system for getting that correspondence, getting it to the right people, and making sure that people can get answers. So I can see that some people's questions weren't answered, and I want to make sure I offered that opportunity.
Yeah, no, thank you, Roger. And we will also be going through the Q&A afterwards and directly reaching out. I'm sorry that we weren't able to get to everyone's questions, but I appreciated, that we had really robust discussion and we were able to answer many of the questions, but we will be following up afterwards with anyone whose questions we weren't able to get to. So I just wanted to take a moment to thank all the panelists for sharing your expertise, and for all of you for joining us today. Following the conclusion of the event, you'll receive an email with a link to a survey about the session and the overall summit. Please complete it for a chance to win an Amazon gift card. I hope you will join us at 11 for our next session, which is entitled Advocating at the IEP Meeting, Strategies for Success, What Every Parent Needs to Know. And I want to thank Ed and Roger and Patricia again. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good rest of your conference.